Okay, so my name is Bruce Newberger. I'm co-chair of the Luncheon Committee with Donna of the Beachwood Chamber of Commerce, and I also run Dynamics Online, an internet marketing agency. And it's my pleasure to have as our guest today Russ Mitchell from WKYC Channel 3 News.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone for having me today.
I want to give just a little bit of background. You may not know Russ Mitchell had a very prominent role on CBS up to 8 years ago when he came to Cleveland. And so that's definitely something that we as Clevelanders find fascinating, and that is somebody choosing to come here. And so that's something we're going to get into. But just to give you a little bit of background, he's the anchor and managing editor of Channel 3 News and appears at 6 and 11 p.m. on weekdays. He's the former anchor of the CBS Evening News Weekend Edition and The Early Show on Saturday, and national correspondent for CBS News Sunday Morning and CBS Evening News and The Early Show, and joined the staff of Channel 3 in 2012. He's just celebrating 8 years here in Cleveland. During his career before Cleveland, he was born and grew up in St. Louis. He worked in Kansas City, Dallas, New York, Washington, probably a couple of other places, and now Cleveland. So we're very lucky to have him. He was on the anchor desk with Dan Rather on September 11th, 2001, and reported from Ground Zero and other parts of Manhattan on the days and the weeks that followed. And he also anchored CBS special report coverage on the capture and death of Osama bin Laden. So we're very lucky to have him in Cleveland. So let's start with that question, and that is...
Thank you.
So what went into your decision to select Cleveland as your home? Did you have any ties here and ever done any business here, or...
Sure.
You know...
Let me just say, first of all, thanks again for inviting me here today. I live in Shaker Heights, right down the street. Yes, holla, Shaker Heights, definitely. To Mayor Sellers, I think I single-handedly keep #1 Chinese food in business. And Mayor Horowitz, I've been known to spend a lot of time with the giant eagle up on Chagrin as well. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I feel so much a part of this community, and this is an honor to be able to speak to you today. To answer your question, no ties to Cleveland. I had been at CBS at that point about 20 years. Had traveled the world, a wonderful experience, but it is one of those kind of jobs where your bag is always packed. You'll get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you'll be told you're going to Jordan, Montana for 3 months, or you're going to Bosnia for 2 months, or you're going to go to Haiti for whatever. And at a time in your life, it's fun. And it got to the point where I was looking to go back to local TV. I had worked in local TV prior to joining CBS. And looked around the country, and Cleveland was my last stop. And when I came here, and my then general manager, Brooke Spektorski, showed me around town and took me to that beautiful building on Lakeside Avenue. And I don't know if you've seen it, Channel 3. I said, this is the spot. And it's worked out really well for me. Tomorrow, in fact, marks my eighth anniversary in Cleveland. And I am so pleased that I made this decision 8 years ago.
All right. Well, I think we all know Cleveland is home, and you've discovered that also. Mm-hmm. So that's terrific. So one of the things that we as business people have to do sometimes is talk people into moving to Cleveland. So, from your perspective, what are some suggestions you'd have to us as business people to lure talent to come to Cleveland, or maybe even to host a business meeting here?
A friendly community, certainly. A very affordable community, especially when you compare it to other parts of the country. But one thing I've had a chance to be a part of lately is I'm a member of the local chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. And we worked, hello, yeah, hi. And we worked along with Destination Cleveland trying to get the 2025 National NABJ convention to Cleveland. And I had a firsthand look at how they do things, how Destination Cleveland gets folks here. And it is quite unique. And this answers your question in that they tell people and show people, and this is so true, what a wonderful community Cleveland is. And if you're coming here for a convention, if you're coming here for a business conference, if you're coming here to work, the entire community embraces you. We really want you here. We're like that. We're like Avis. We try harder. And it works. And they were telling me the process of how they got the 2016 Republican convention. And it was that. They brought people here and convinced those folks, rightfully so, how much Cleveland wanted them to come. And they saw how amazing Cleveland was when they got here. I had the privilege of not only covering the convention here in Cleveland, but the Democratic convention the next week in Philadelphia. And everyone there I talked to said, you know what? Cleveland did this so much better. So the fact that we want you, the fact that we're a wonderful town, the fact that we have so many great things to offer, we're a hidden gem in many circles. The more we highlight that, I think the better we'll do on that, and the more conventions, the more business meetings, and the more great people we'll get to come to town.
Great. So getting back to the topics of your career, what inspired you to select journalism as a career, and who in journalism inspired you? I happened to watch the interview on YouTube of you interviewing Walter Cronkite.
Yeah,
So,
well, that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
We got to spend, I guess he was celebrating his 50th anniversary at CBS, and we got to go and spend some time with him at his house in Martha's Vineyard. And as a kid who grew up watching Walter Cronkite, and there are a few of you who remember who Walter Cronkite was, I think, in the room, that was absolutely a thrill. My mother says I talked a lot as a kid. And she knew at that point I was going to do something here. But I think it was just a natural curiosity. It's the old story of being a high school journalist and catching the bug. Got to go to a workshop at the university I eventually attended, the University of Missouri, a workshop that I attended when I was in high school, and caught the bug and said this is something I wanted to do. And I was so pumped up when I left this workshop, and I guess I'm 17 years old. I got back to St. Louis, and I said, I'm going to get a job in a TV station. Come hell or high water, I'm going to get a job in a TV station. Keep in mind, I'm 17 years old. I'm going to my senior year of high school. So my cousin tells me about a job at the local ABC affiliate. And I go, wow. Again, I'm 17. Is it an anchor job? She said, no. Is it a reporter's job? She said, no. And I kind of went down the list. And she said, what's your job? You would be the night switchboard operator. And I go, wow. So I got the job and did that my senior year of high school. And as you discover in this business and probably many others, it's a small world. And in that year, I learned so much about how the broadcast industry operates and got to work with some of the people who worked in the newsroom then years later, because people move in this business. And one of my producers at CBS was a producer at the station in St. Louis when I was a teenager. So all those things combined really said to me, I want to do this. And growing up, there was an anchor in St. Louis named Julius Hunter, who I admired. Ed Bradley, of course, the late Ed Bradley, watching on CBS, I admired. Dan Rather, who I got to work with later, and Walter Cronkite. Those are my professional heroes, and I'm so lucky. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I got to work with all of these people.
My luncheon committee wanted me to ask you if you knew Andy Rooney.
Andy Rooney's office was down the hall from mine for a while when I worked at CBS, and Andy would come in. I remember he would come in the elevator, now every day at work, I'm on TV, I wear a tie. Every time I would see Andy Rooney in the elevator, he goes, you got a tie on, you must be going on TV. And I go, yes, sir, I'm probably going on TV today. That was the extent of my conversations with Andy Rooney. But just to be able to tell people that Andy Rooney's office was down the hall from mine, I thought was pretty cool.
So I happen to be about halfway through streaming the first season of a TV show called The Morning Show, and so you get to see a lot of what's happening behind the scenes, really right up to the drama, right up to the second that the camera goes on. So can you tell us a couple of things we'd be surprised to learn happens behind the scenes in TV news production?
Wow, we're taping this, you say? Devorah, I want to retire someday and get a cake like Devorah, so I'm going to be really careful with my answer here. I think people who come to the studio are surprised at just how calm things are in the studio. When you go in the control room, that's when things get nuts. I think people are surprised at the collaborative process. You see people on television, but there are tons of people behind the scenes who help put that on, who are probably the most important cogs in that wheel. In terms of funny, goofy stories that you don't know, there have been a few of those. And you mentioned the morning show. I worked in morning TV at CBS for about 15 years, and that's a grind. You're getting up every morning at 2 o'clock. You're going to work. You've got to be smiling between 7 and 9 o'clock or whatever when you don't want to do that some days. There have been a number of stories there. I'll tell you one that will not get me in trouble. I was interviewing a couple once. They had just written a book on how to improve your marriage. Okay, so it's let's call it 7:10 they're supposed to be on. So during the break, the wife walks out, and she sits down. I go, "Oh, hi," and the producer says, "Where's your husband?" "Oh, he's on the way." And we said, "Okay, we've got 2 minutes before we go on." So he shows up 30 seconds before the interview. So we do the interview, and after I said, "I'm sorry you were late." He goes, "Oh, I went to the wrong building. We just got divorced. I went to the wrong building, so we didn't come here today." And I was thinking, and I said to myself, now, had I known this before the interview, would I have brought that up? So there are all sorts of surprises like that you run into. And there are many more, but that's one I can tell and not get in trouble, I think.
Okay, well, someday we'll all be reading your memoir, and we'll hear all those stories. That's great. So this is a question you answered here at the table, but it was really a good answer. I want everyone to hear it. So we've all heard discussion about bias in the mainstream media. That's certainly been a hot topic for the last few years. What are some steps that news consumers can use to ensure they're getting their news without bias, and is that even possible?
Without bias, sometimes it's impossible. However, I do still think there's some down-the-road venues out there you can watch. I do say to people, as I said at the table, my advice to consumers is get your news from many different sources. Read several newspapers, not only the New York Times and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, but also the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. The Washington Times is a very conservative paper. Be well-rounded that way as well. On the internet, it is very easy these days to get in a bubble where you're only getting information that you believe in. What I tell people is try to get your news on the internet from as many sources as possible, because that's the way that the world operates these days. And it's also the same thing with cable channels. You can watch CNN and get one view. You can watch MSNBC and get another view. Fox News, you think you're watching 3 different stories, at times. However, if you're able to watch all of those for a time, you're able in your head to figure out, this is what I believe. You can come to it from an educated standpoint. I have a relative, again, because we're taping this, I'm not going to say his name, who every week will send me something from some obscure website. Did you know this? And usually it's like, somebody's got 8 heads or something like that. And I go, dude, do you just get your news from here? And I say, hey, look around. Because I think as a news consumer, it's best to shop around and to give yourself a wide perspective. When you're not watching Channel 3, okay, it's okay to flip around, and see what other folks are doing. And I think that we do a very good job of keeping it down the middle. The problem you run into now is, and I'm very lucky, the experiences that I've had at the network and beyond, I've been in the White House, covered wars, that kind of stuff. So I think that I try to put some things in perspective. There's a lot of stuff out there that you don't get perspective from, but that's kind of how I see my role these days. Sometimes people misinterpret that, and that's not the point. Perspective today is more important than it ever has been before. So find a place where that perspective is something you can trust, that you think that the people giving it to you are smart and know what they're talking about, and as well as kind of shopping around. And I think you'll be a good news consumer.
That's great advice. Do you watch the Saturday Night Live Weekend Update parody?
Every week.
And
yes.
So my question is, do you think that's funny, or how would you make it even better?
I think it's a scream. Some weeks are better than others, obviously. I don't know how I would make it better, but it's. I like it. It's interesting you mentioned that. And at the table, we were talking about how news consumption has changed these days. The $64 million question in newsrooms is, how do you get younger people to watch the news? They did not grow up with appointment viewing, as many of us did in the room. In St. Louis at 5:30, we sat down and watched Mr. Cronkite. And if you didn't watch Mr. Cronkite at 5:30, you were, whatever. You're not going to see it. Now, folks don't have to do that. And an entire generation has been, has never had to do that. So the question is, how do you get people to watch? What kind of things do you do to get those younger people in the tent? And one of the things that I've heard in being in some meetings over the years, trying to do that is, hey, we should do an SNL type newscast. That'll get them in. And you see a little bit of that, in the Bill Maher's and the John Oliver's, which are very smart programs. But I think as we move on, you're going to see more mainstream channels, what we call mainstream, doing things like that. Not as outrageous, of course, as SNL. But I think you're going to see some people moving to that as they try to figure out what that formula is to get young people in. The average age, by the way, and I'll be 60 in March, so I can say this. The average age of a viewer of a nightly newscast these days is 62. Advertisers stop caring about us at 55, okay? It's 24 to 54, I believe, is what it is. So if my boss, Mickey Burns, and Adam Miller, my director of content, who grew up here in this area as well, will tell you that if you can figure out how to do that, I tell you that your golden ticket awaits you, because no one's been able to figure that out yet.
We've certainly seen a lot of experimentation in the newspaper field with different online delivery of news. What's going on, or is what does the future look like in 5 or 10 years in terms of mainstream TV news?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the executives in many media companies will tell you the internet. Tell you that's the phone, the internet. That's where it's going, and you see many companies pushing viewers toward that. And in fact, if you watch Channel 3 or any channel in town, at some point you will hear the phrase, "For more, go to WKYC.com." The problem with that is the revenue is not there. For every, I don't think it's changed in like 20 years. And for every, dollar that an advertiser spends on broadcast, that advertiser will spend 15 cents on the internet, or somewhere around there. And that hasn't changed. So I think executives will tell you that that's the way that things are going. And they're trying to figure out how to monetize that at this point. But I think you're going to see more experimentation, like the SNL stuff. We have a newscast, a new 5 o'clock newscast that begins in January at 5 o'clock. It's going to be called What's New. It's an hour-long newscast. It's with Jay Crawford, who worked at CNN for a while. I'm sorry, ESPN for a while. And it is going to be a different kind of newscast. It's going to be more lifestyle. There'll be some news elements in it. But again, that's one of those ways of experimentation and trying to figure out what works, what will get more people to watch.
Can you tell us some stories that you've reported on that inspired you personally, either locally or in your previously in your career?
Yeah, 9/11. Obviously was one of those periods in my life that I'll never forget. I was walking into the CBS Broadcast Center on 57th Street, if you're familiar with New York, at 8:48 Tuesday morning that day. And it was a beautiful day. It was just a lovely day. It's called a 9/11 day, which if you were around that day, you called it that. Just a crystal clear day. And a friend of mine was running out of the building across the street. He worked for Inside Edition. And I said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I'm going to World Trade Center. A plane just hit it. We think it was a mistake." So in the 50 yards that I had to walk between the 57th Street and the newsroom, it was clear what had happened. And of course, it was at 9:01 the second plane hit, and they told me get up there. And I was there with Rather for about 8 hours that day. It was surreal. I can remember in my head thinking, the world is coming to an end. Really, the American empire is falling today. Every empire in history has fallen. This is our day, but you can't do that, on TV. In the months and the weeks and months that followed, just being around New York, because I lived there, I took it very personally. It was surreal to be in an environment that when I left my job, the job stayed with me. Because usually in this job, you will come to work, you do your job, you leave, it sticks with you in some way, but this, was something that it couldn't leave you. And it changed my life, it changed the way I looked at life, and it still does today. I will tell you a funny story, though, about this to kind of button that part up. About 4 months after 9/11, I was driving to work. Yes, I had a car. I said, I'm going to drive. I loved driving. And I cut a guy off as I was turning the street. I said, sorry, he flipped me the bird. And I went, this is great, we're back. New York is back. So it was something that changed me, it changed New York, it changed the way a lot of people looked at it. So that was one. The other one, very quickly, what I think locally, too, was the high school shooting at Chardon. I had been here about a month, and just seeing how that community came together and got past that, and how those kids came together and really showed what a great community that was and what a great community that I had moved to. And the miracle in Cleveland, where you had 3 women, of course, found that house on Seymour Avenue after being kidnapped for 10 years. I was not here when they were kidnapped, but of course, heard the stories when I got here. And the night that they were found, it was May, I believe, 2012 or 13. I think we all there had this feeling of, you know what, if you ever have given up hope in your life, if nothing else, this story will tell you never give up hope. And those are things, those are among the stories that have stuck with me over the years.
Yeah, that's really amazing. So anyway, talking about us in the Cleveland area now, you probably see a lot more of the area than we do. Where do you think that Cleveland's business climate is heading in terms of attracting companies? I think we all struggle with the airport and where you can get direct flights to. What are you hearing from business leaders, and where do you think we're heading in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to keep our eye on Sherwin-Williams to see what they do. Hopefully they'll stay in the city, and depending on what day of the week it is, one day they're staying in the city, the next day they're going to Cincinnati. I think that'll be a bellwether for a lot of things here. I really, the business climate is in terms of that is kind of out of my realm. But I will tell you this, one thing that has struck me in being here, this is a wonderful community. Like any community, we have issues. City of Cleveland has a crime problem. There's a poverty problem. There are areas around Northeast Ohio, like anywhere else, that have these issues. It has always surprised me that the business community as a whole has not visibly embraced those problems and come out and say, we're going to stop this. Because if you solve those problems, more people will, I think you'll get more people here. We'll get more people here. I think that it's something that, that the community can say, that we are visibly trying to fix this problem. I know that companies are doing things silently. I know that they're doing a lot of stuff. I know that various public officials are doing great stuff. I know some wonderful things are going on in this community. I would love to see the business community come out on a Monday morning after, unfortunately, 10 people are shot in Cleveland and say, you know what, we live here too. We're not going to tolerate this, and we're going to work with the city visibly in every way we possibly can to fix this problem. It's always surprised me and been a little, and I've told the few business leaders I've had a chance to talk to about that, I've shared that with them as well. And I hope that someday that happens.
Well, you've got a big audience here in 2 chambers of commerce, so we're listening. We could see you every day on television, but, what can you tell us to get to know you personally a little bit better? Or, maybe even is there something on your bucket list, personally or professionally, that you'd like to share?
Yeah.
If you say it, it's more likely to happen.
Well, I've been to 49 states. Alaska is still on the list. We've got to go there. I enjoy movies. I obviously enjoy #1 Chinese because I go there a lot. At this point in my life, it's just great to be in a community where I can do all these things and feel comfortable about it. New York is great. There are a lot of wonderful things about it, and I go there, fairly regularly, and I get my dose of that. I turn into the Hulk when I land at LaGuardia, and I'm back to David Banner when I'm back in Cleveland. But I think I am. If you look up "lucky" in the dictionary, you're going to find my picture. Seriously, I am incredibly fortunate. This is something that I'm lucky. I knew I always wanted to do this. I've been fortunate to be able to do this now for almost 40 years. It's something that I don't take for granted. My oldest daughter is 29, and she went to Washington University in St. Louis, and she called me one day, and she didn't know what she wanted to do when she was graduating. I said, you got to figure it out, because WashU is pretty expensive. Very expensive. And she went to, she told me, she said, Daddy, guess what? NASCAR is coming to campus today to interview. She said, I'm going to go. I go, that's great. She goes, what's NASCAR? So I said, there's this thing called Google. You may want to look it up. And she got it, and she got the job at NASCAR, was there for 3 years. She now does marketing at US Track and Field in Indianapolis. But she was very lucky in that. She fell into that. And I look back at my own journey. This is something I've always wanted to do for so long. And the fact that I'm able to do it and still able to do it is something that, that I think drives me in many ways.
That's great. I mean, you really have had the drive throughout your whole career, starting with the nighttime switchboard. So,
good evening, KTVI too. Yeah.
you know, I just think that's really a great lesson for all of us to learn as business people. You know, sometimes you gotta, take the opportunities that come to you. So, speaking of opportunities, we have a few minutes for questions, and so if you can raise your hand, I'm going to come to you with the microphone, and then you can ask the question into the microphone, or Donna will come to you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for being open and honest and telling your truth. Jerome Duvall with the City of Warrensville Heights Office of Economic Development. My question to you is, there is a lot going on with attacks on the media and truth and facts. And how do you guys counter that with continuing to be able to, stay above the fray and still be able to do your job effectively?
That's a great question. You should see my emails that I get these days. When I came here from CBS, it was when it's CBS, and granted this was 8 years ago. It was hard to get in touch with someone on the air. You had to go through several different channels to do that. When I came here, I remember the first time I saw my name, underneath my picture. It had my email address on it. I said, "Why don't you just put abuse me?" Underneath that. And in 8 years, we've gotten even more accessible, with everything else. Again, we try to play it down the middle. These days, you're not going to please anybody. After any newscast, I will get. There's this thing going on today called impeachment. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a really big thing. I guarantee you, when we do that story tonight, we'll get emails from both sides saying we were biased. And honestly, those are the days where you go, we must have done our job because, we've gone down the middle and everybody has a problem with it. It's difficult these days. And especially, and this is not a political statement, when the leader of the free world is telling people we're the enemy of the people. It's tough. And I have friends who cover rallies, not just a President Trump rally, but other rallies where these types of things are thrown out there, and they're scared. They're physically scared sometimes. So I hope that this is a period that will pass. I hope the media gets stronger because of it. It doesn't help when there are the occasional mistakes that are made, because that's ammunition for people to say, see, you're biased, see, you're this, see, you're that. But I think that this period in time is just making the media hopefully a little stronger and making us more careful. Every word that I have in front of me, that what happens in a typical day is I'll walk in at 3 o'clock or so in the afternoon and talk to the producers about what we're doing that night. The producer writes a draft of the story as we talk about what's going to be on. Every single word that I'm reading that night, I have gone through, and I've changed. I've put a perspective on. I've put it in my language, my voice, because I think that's important these days. But it's become more important than ever to do that, because you don't want to be you want to give that down the middle view of what's happening, and you don't want to give anybody the ammunition to say that you felt this way or the other. It's tough, and because it is out there so much, because the message is out there, just hammered to people. We're the enemy of the people, can't trust them, that kind of thing. There's some people who believe it. I did an event a couple of years ago with Esperanza, education group in Cleveland, and the main speaker that day, the guest speaker, was Bishop Nelson Perez. And I don't know what was going on that summer, but it was a particularly bad time for the media. We were getting hammered big time. And Bishop Perez, in giving his presentation, said, "You know what I want to do? I want to thank the media." And I went, "Oh my God, Bishop, thank you very much, because we don't hear that a lot these days. So we're plugging along, doing the best we can, but sometimes in this environment it's hard.
Hi.
Hi.
I actually have two questions. So the
Okay.
first is when crafting your ability to stay neutral, not only in giving the story, but in your partner. So in the person you work with, have you always gotten along with the people you work with, and how do you manage that when you're on camera?
Sure.
And then the second question is when you have kids, working on, like you said, how do you get kids to watch the news?
Mhm.
Is there something that is a little bit less scary? Because I'm a grown-up and the news is scary. So is there something a little bit tamer that you would say with kids we could introduce them to be able to have good conversations?
Yeah, it's really a question. In terms of the first, I'm very lucky. Have I always gotten along with my co-anchors here at Channel 3? Yes. How about that? It's an interesting dance because that co-anchor becomes your work wife or your work husband, and you would be surprised in history at people that you've seen on a national level who seem like they get along great who hate each other, and that's hard to fake, but people do fake it. But I've been very lucky in that way. My co-anchor now, Sarah Shookman, is from Akron. This is a wonderful human being. We have similar sensibilities. We both know our roles in the operation, and I'm very lucky because not everybody can say that. And I've heard stories and know of people who haven't been as lucky as I've been on that front. There have been people I've worked with in the past that we weren't pals. We were fine professionally. I've been lucky that I've worked with professionals for most of my career. But we were never going to be pals. But it was okay. But watch closely sometimes. You can usually tell when maybe there's an issue going on there. In terms of easing kids into it, there are certain publications or certain places online. I believe Highlights Magazine still does it, or Scholastic still does it, where they will have almost like a kid's view of the news, and it's a good place to start to kind of get them interested in that. I can't think really of anything on television that does that right now. Channel 3 years ago, I'm told, used to have a kids news show, which I think is a great idea, which we should bring back to again, bring people up and get them used to watching us. But online, I think it's things like Scholastic and Highlights, and some newspapers actually have kids sections. It's been interesting in this whole impeachment inquiry debate that some newspapers have had special sections dedicated to what this means, and you would think that they were written for 3-year-olds, but they weren't. They're written for us because this is new territory for many of us. So look for things like that you think can introduce your kids to watching the news, or something that makes it interesting for them if they have a particular interest. I know NBC does a Dylan Dreyer, the anchor, does a show on Saturday mornings on animal life. It's very kid friendly. It gets them involved in that. If your child is involved in sports, anything on ESPN, I think is great, because I think of when I became interested, my first interest was sports. I was going to be third baseman for the St. Louis Cardinals. The whole no talent thing got in the way, but that's how I became interested in listening to ball games. So things like that. But in terms of something specific other than those two things I mentioned, I really can't think of anything right now. Sure.
Good afternoon, Russ. Audrey Wiggins, Altogether Marketing.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, I know you. Hey, Audrey, how are you?
Yes, yes. My question for you is, what's next for Russ Mitchell? What's your future look like?
Wow, it's great. Like, Devora. Yeah. At some point, no. I don't know. I'm in a good place right now. I enjoy being here. I am probably the only on-air person in Cleveland, one of the only on-air people in Cleveland who is not trying to get to the network, because I've already done that. I've done that. I'm very happy here. I'm not looking to do something like that. In fact, the biggest compliment somebody can pay me in the grocery store is say, hey, you ever thought about going to network? Because that tells me they knew nothing about what I did before that, but they think that maybe I have the chops to go there. That's the nicest compliment anybody can ever pay me. So I don't know. I want to do this for a few more years and continue to try to do the best I can. And maybe I'll be on a beach in Sri Lanka at some point down the road. You never know. But this is a lot of fun. It's good to see you.
Okay, and one last question we have.
Hi, Nicole
Hi.
Johnson, City of Warrensville. How do you disconnect? And from an administrative side, do they offer counseling, EAP services for you when you're doing those hard stories? And is that afforded to everyone?
It is on. It is what happens in a. I'm thinking about it in a big story. If something comes up, 9/11, for instance, I go back to that. I remember CBS offered counseling, for people after that. As a rule, it's not something that, that they offer. But in big stories like that, they'll say, hey, if you want to talk to somebody, we're going to have people here. After Chardon here, I know the station did that. And they provided counseling. They actually brought counselors in to talk to people. Many times as a reporter, this stuff doesn't hit you until you leave. And 9/11, and I keep going back to that, I was constantly working for 2 months, and it didn't hit me like a month and a half, what had happened. I remember the moment I was sitting in a restaurant, having dinner, and boom, it just kind of came on. And I did talk to somebody after that, and CBS provided that. So it does happen. On a general basis, no. I mean, if there's a bad story tonight, I say bad story, a story involving tragedy, more than likely it's not, something other than like your insurance that the station's going to provide for you. But during those times when I think it's needed the most, I think they're very good about that. And disconnect. I read a lot of books, go to the movies a lot, those kind of things to kind of disconnect. And one of the great things about this job, although I must tell you, as a reporter, you want to be in the middle of a story. So yes, I wish I was in D.C. today, covering this story. But one of the great things about this job is my bag is not always packed. And I know that when I come home at night, I'm not going to get a call to go to Jordan, Montana, and go for 3 months. And that makes being able to disconnect a little easier, given the perspective that I have.
So, by the way, these are really were the best audience questions I can remember us ever having. So thank you for that. Thank you, audience. It's it really had been a couple of years that our luncheon committee had bounced around the idea of having Russ Mitchell come and speak to us, and we kept saying, well, who has some avenue to get to Russ Mitchell? And I guess we never came up with one until now. And I got to tell you, it really exceeded every expectation we had. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.